Problem set 4. Problem set 4. Solution. I couldn't record this in the last seminar session because of the malfunctioning of the software. Recording software didn't basically record it. Apparently, at the end, I discovered that it was just running without doing anything. That was a strange situation. Now, explain the concept. So this is the first question, right? So question number 1, A. Explain the concepts of negative externality and positive externality. Externalities are usually knock-on effects on third parties that are not involved in consumption or production of the goods. In the process of production, for example, negative externality means the cost on others imposed by the producing company, for example, pollution, for example. If you live next to a factory, the pollution coming from the or the CO2 emissions, for example, coming from the factory usually are the externalities or negative externalities that are not internalized or considered by the factory owners. So it's not accounted for. These negative externalities not accounted for in their production decisions. So that's a negative externality. Now, a positive externality could be a benefit to the bystanders of, let's say, production of something or a consumption of something, let's say. For example, positive externality of vaccination is a well-known example. If a friend of yours is vaccinated, basically they are healthy. That means you will not catch disease. Well, they won't. I mean, in the sense that their immune system is strong, depending on the type of vaccination. For example, flu jab makes them less likely to have a flu during the winter, and since they are less likely to have a flu, you will not have a flu as well as a result by interacting with them, right? So that's the positive externality of them, of their having a flu jab. Right, so these are the two examples now. Now moving on to B. Using an appropriate example, explain the difference between private cost and the social cost, and a private benefit and the social benefit. Now I think it's best to write something there, type, maybe demonstrate it by typing. So let's start with private cost first. We'll start with production. Let's call it production. Private cost of production. Private cost of production is basically the cost of, let's say, cost of goods produced. This could include raw materials, wages, rent. Well, let's call it overhead costs. So these are fixed costs usually. Now these are kind of monetary costs. So these are the price costs. Now what is the social cost? Social cost of production, for example. These are private costs plus external costs, right? So we added the external cost to private cost to come up with the so-called social cost. Now, the definition of private cost is clear to you. Now, what is an external cost? External cost is the cost arising from externality. So it's imposed on the bystanders. So in this process, for example, production of this, let's say, of a good, we usually have a private cost, which are these, right? We, as a business decision makers, we usually account for these costs and then price accordingly of our final product. Now, however, we do not usually account for external costs, but when we do account for external costs, then we are actually accounting for total social cost here, or we're considering the social cost of our actions or activities let's say in the economy. Now, external costs could be the external effect of our production that is pollution, for example, on the bystanders, or damage to the environment of our activities. For example, we could be producing goods and dumping the waste into the river without paying for the cleanup, for example. These are basically the external costs to the production process. Now, what else could be included in there? Well, we can take many other examples. For example, airlines. Airlines usually, their private cost is usually any cost that has been paid for by them. That includes raw material costs, for example, food costs for the passengers, wages of the flight attendants and everyone involved in the flight, and overheads, just the rent payments, for example. Yeah. And based on that, they make a decision on to fly for profit when it comes to ticketing or pricing the tickets. If they were to include the pollution from the airlines or when they fly the planes, they would have considered the social cost, or in other words, they would have added on top of the private costs that they usually consider the external costs as well. So the social cost is just the sum of the two, right? So that's it. A bit more detailed explanation now. Now, private benefit. Private benefit in production or consumption. Usually private benefits are easy to explain with consumption. So consumption. Now, private benefit could be a satisfaction gained from consuming a good. Let's say buying a bicycle. Buying a bicycle. Right. So now, oops, that's my typo there. Now, social benefit. You could have included the vaccination, for example, here, inoculation. That would have been private. That would have created an external benefit to as well to the bystanders. Now, social benefit here is basically private benefit plus the external benefit captured by the bystanders but not paid for benefit. Yeah. So now what could the external benefit be? Now, if you bought a bicycle, since you are, your private benefit would be the satisfaction you gain from riding the bicycle. External benefit is then the less congestion in the road, because you will not be driving if you are cycling to work, or you will not be using the public transport. And also emissions, for example, is a good one. If you're driving, you would have created fumes. Basically, your driving would have created pollution. So these are by riding bicycle to work, for example, to uni, you are not actually contributing towards this sort of negative externalities. So the benefits include then such benefit to the third parties. Yeah, the environmentally friendly, or the environment will not have the damage from your activity. And less congestion, for example, would be another benefit that others would have enjoyed if you were not driving or riding a bicycle. Yeah. So let's say less congestion, less emission, and what else could be more space on public transport, because you're not driving car, less congestion, you are riding a bicycle, less emission, and there's also more space on public transport since you are just riding a bicycle. Right. And you will also be healthy. You will keep fit, let's say, by riding a bicycle instead, yeah, of driving. In a supply and demand diagram, show produce and consume surplus in the market equilibrium. Now, supply and demand curve. Let's draw them. So that's our quantity, this is our price. Right? Now supply, if you remember, is a upper sloping line. Demand, on the other hand, is a downward sloping demand line. Now this is our equilibrium point, quantity equilibrium, and this is our equilibrium price. Now let's give an example before we explain what the consumer surplus is. Let's say this is the demand for PS4 device, and this is supply for PS4 as well again. Right? You say you have this is an equilibrium price of, let's say, £300. And let's say that you have a budget for PS4, a new PS4, and then you set out to buy this, set off to shops to buy this this device, for example, yeah, and your budget is, let's say, 380. Now when you went to the shop and saw that prices, they were equilibrium prices, £300 each, rather than the 380 you have planned to buy. So now you bought it as a result for £300, let's assume. That leaves you with £800 surplus. This is called consumer surplus. You're willing to purchase, so remember the demand curve shows or reflects the willingness to purchase at given prices, a given quantity, yeah? So you are the marginal consumers, you are buying the first unit, for example, yeah, for 380. But then price in the market is 300, so the difference now is called consumer surplus here. Now the next consumer will buy the second unit, but they are willing, their budget could be 375, but they are still paying £300. So this area was yours, your consumer surplus, and their consumer surplus is this area, and so on and so forth. If you add everyone's consumer surplus up until we reach the equilibrium point here, we have the whole area covered. This area is basically consumer surplus area. It basically shows us the consumer surplus or in the market for PS4s. Now, so by definition then is this, if you define it properly, consumer surplus is basically the difference between what a consumer is willing to pay and what they actually pay for the product, yeah? So the difference is consumer surplus. Now you were willing to pay £380, but you paid £300 for the device. Now producer surplus is the difference between what the market price is, market equivalent price is, and the price that the producers are willing to sell. So if you remember, supply curve shows the costs of products, the cost of products or price of products and quantities, remember? So the economists usually call it also a cost of production or the marginal cost of production. So let's not complicate it a bit. I've been using the term price. So let's say this one producer is willing to sell, let's say, third unit at this, let's say at this price, whatever the price here is, let's say £120, yeah? But in the market, the equilibrium price is £300. So the difference, so they sell the goods, the PS4 for £300, and as a result, the difference here is £80. The £80 is the producer surplus. This is their benefit, yeah. So this whole area basically is then, as a result, if we add up every producer surplus, then, or the producer surplus from selling every other unit, remaining units, up to the equilibrium price, then we achieve, or we create a highlighted area that's called producer surplus here. So this is all producer surplus. Yeah, this is all producer surplus. Yeah. So that's the answer to this question. Hopefully it was clear to you. Next question now. By the way, the sum of producer surplus and consumer surplus is called total surplus. And usually surplus, consumer and producer surplus, are minimized or distorted by taxation. Right, so this next question is about taxation. So explain how tax paid by sellers and buyers affect the total surplus. Now, in question 5, we actually do a proper explanation of this, but now let's discuss this as well quickly. Usually, let's say with sellers, usually we check seller side taxation is easier to explain. So this is quantity and price, and this is our demand, this is our supply. Let's say that this is equilibrium price. So right now we have quantity equilibrium, price equilibrium. Right now this is a huge, this huge area here, this huge area here is basically the total surplus, make up the total surplus. This is the market equilibrium here, and oops, what happened to note? Apologies. Okay, it's back now. Based on the market equilibrium prices, the consumers are enjoying I don't know what's happening, I'm sorry. So let's back to notes. Not helpful. So producers and consumers are enjoying a total surplus of a certain amount, let's say. Now, let's say that the government taxes the suppliers of the good. Now, if you remember, when tax is imposed on the supply side, it's a cost to supply of that product, yeah? It's a cost of production usually. It usually shifts the supply curve to left. If the government taxes the buyers of a certain product, then obviously it increases the price and it shifts the demand to the left. Now we look at the seller side. In both cases, shifting to the left of this curve basically results in lower consumer and producer surplus, and that reduces the total surplus. Now let me demonstrate this with the supply shift. Let's say there's a tax rate of some t, and that actually, let's say this is the amount of tax t, and this taxation shifts the supply curve to the left, yeah. That results in, oops, for some reason. Okay, let's clean it and continue it properly. Getting it to, okay, getting it back, yeah, that's better. This is right. So this is a shift to the left. This is a shift to the left of the original supply curve after the taxation. So this is ST, supply with the tax after the taxation. Oh, that looks like 5. Ignore it. And now what happened is that this is our new equilibrium. Now after the shift, this was the old equilibrium. After the tax, we have a new quantity with the tax. Yeah, this was E, this is Q1, and this is our new P1 here, P1 new price. Now what happened here is this. This is the new price that consumers pay. As a result, their consumer surplus is this area only. You see, this is this area, because the surplus was, if you remember, price you're willing to pay, difference between the price you're willing to pay, which is along the demand curve, and what you pay. So this is the equilibrium, that what you pay. This is what you pay here, P1. For producers, producer surplus was the difference between what they receive in terms of price, yeah, the price they sell the good at. So this is P2 here. This is the price they sell it the good at, yeah, because this is the supply. This is where the old supply point comes down to. So if you highlight this area, this would be the producer surplus. Now, then you have the tax. This much tax. This was the tax. Yeah, this area here is the amount of tax. This distance, the interval here shows us the amount of tax, which is the same as this one here. If we look at the tax area here, or it's a rectangle. If you multiply x, let's say, by y, the length by the height, width by the height, it gives us this area, surface of this area, and this is the This is the government revenue or tax revenue. Yeah, it goes to tax revenue to government. Yeah, you see, so consumer surplus basically shrank, producer surplus here shrank, and government basically took a big chunk of the two surpluses, yeah, or the consumers and producer surplus. So as a result, total surplus declined, and this area here is now deadweight loss because no one is capturing this area. It's not being captured by uh, producers or suppliers. None of them are capturing. And government is also not capturing it, right? By shifting the supply curve. The same idea holds if you just shift the demand curve by taxing the consumers by the same amount of tax. Yeah. So that's the demonstration of the answer from the perspective of sellers. And in the interest of time, I will not demonstrate the consumer side effect, but it is the same basically. It is the same. If you need help, just do come to my office hour. We'll sit down and explain you. Explain in words what is deadweight loss. Basically, we've already seen what the deadweight loss in terms of graphs. It's just efficiency loss. Here, it's a benefit that hasn't been captured by anyone. Basically, it's loss of allocative efficiency. Basically, in the absence of taxation or any intervention, this area would have been captured by split into two halves basically, and one half would go to producers and the other half would have been enjoyed by the suppliers. Now that the quantity demanded or supply decreased, basically that led to the loss of this efficiency here. Right, so when the equilibrium is distorted, that's what happens. We lose some of the surplus, so total surplus declines. Yeah, that's the answer here. Next, we go to question 2 now. I'm hoping that this will not take long. In the lecture, we stated that government can enact tax or pay subsidy in order to internalize externalities. Right, explain how these instruments can be used to address market failure. Now, I'll draw it as well. This is gonna take longer. I have, I think, provided you with the typed answer, but demonstration would also help. This is Q. This is P. So again, we have the supply curve. We have the demand curve. Now, this is 0, 0. So these are the original demand and supply curves. Now, if you remember, we said supply curve reflects the costs of supplying or prices of supplying, prices of goods supplied in the market. Demand curve shows the value or reflects the value we place on goods. So that's the price of goods and the quantities corresponding to each good, each price, yeah, at each price, yeah. So now, let's assume that this is a rubber. This is the supply and demand for rubber. So market is in right now. Market is in equilibrium. So this is called private market is in equilibrium. So that's PE. Maybe we say this is, let's say, $100, 100 pounds, and we supply 100 units. Yeah. Now this is QE, private equilibrium point quantity. Now the rubber manufacturer will certainly be considering. So this is called, let's call it private. Rubber manufacturer will certainly be considering or taking into account the private costs of supplying the rubber. So it includes raw materials cost, wages, rent, and everything. That's a material or monetary costs. Yeah. So this is all reflected on this supply curve here. However, so let's put this way: private costs. Yeah. Costs. However, there is also something called external cost. Yeah, remember for the first question, external cost. External cost. Now, this is not considered by the this part here, the external cost, is not considered by the rubber manufacturer. External cost could be pollution. Remember, rubber manufacturing is basically energy intensive production manufacturing process, and whenever you burn energy, it creates pollution. Basically, rubber itself creates pollution, and waste. Rubber is basically there could be wastage in the production of rubber that could easily be could have been dumped into the nature. Basically, waste also could be damaging the environment. So these are external costs to the environment, or external costs that are not considered by the rubber manufacturer. As a result, they are basically imposed on the bystanders. Pollution basically harms the air. It basically creates all this asthmatic disease, let's say, and waste, let's say, pollutes the marine life, or destroys the marine life if the waste is dumped into sea, let's say. Now, if the rubber manufacturer were to consider the costs together, sum this up, and say social costs, and I mean when we sum this together, remember this would have been a social cost. Yep, social cost would be a private cost and an external cost. So there is then, if the rubber manufacturer considers the external cost in addition to private cost, then there is another supply curve. That is called social cost curve. So this is basically a shift. So let's call S social. This is like a shift, isn't it? To the left usually, because now on top of the private cost, let's say this is cost of some X amount, we are adding some T, let's say T amount. That little shifts our supply to by a T amount. Let's say T could be any £100 or £10, let's say £5, let's say. So when we ignore the social cost, external cost, and only looked at the private costs, to produce and supply 100 units, we were basically getting £100 or receiving £100. That's the price and the cost as well of that. However, if we were to internalize this externality, or if we were to consider the externality, then we should add few quid into the price that we're receiving for the 100 units, and the price should really be higher than that. It should be somewhere here. Yeah, this would be, let's say, 120. It should be the case. But because we are not considering it right now, we are in the private market equilibrium. Now let's say that if we were to consider, then we should be operating along this supply curve instead. Yeah, this time. This is the correct supply curve if we were to consider the external costs. Then our new equilibrium would have been this point. Yeah, this would have been a point. Let's say this is 80 units. Yeah, this is the optimal point if we were Q opt, if we were to consider the external costs. Now, however, we are still here. We are right now along this curve. We are supplying the market along this curve, at the prices along this curve. Now the governments need to then come up with some instruments so that when imposed or enacted, the rubber manufacturers will operate along this curve. And we call these instruments taxation instruments, or Pigovian taxes. Pigovian taxes basically are taxes on producers of goods that have high external costs. Now Pigovian tax should be such that it basically, tax rate should be equal to the external cost of production. In this case, the external cost of production is T, or some £20 apparently here. The difference here is 20, right? So this is the T. So tax rate should be £20, or £20 on each unit. So that then we will force the supplier of this product to operate on the social curve, because it creates an extra production cost. That inaction of the tax basically creates an extra cost of production and forces the supplier to operate or shift back to this socially optimal supply curve here, right? As a result, we now are able to reduce the production of this good to 80, so, and by capturing the external cost as well, or internalizing the external cost, in other words. Yeah. Now, what else could be explained here as part of it? I think that's how the governments address the externalities or internalize the externalities. Right. This was, I mean, the answer to this question was expected to be in words instead, but then by demonstrating this, I would be able to explain you in more details, as you can see. So let's move on. Question 3. Right, we need to type here. Let's see. So, external cost of production. Give 2 examples of each of the following. Now, external cost of production or negative externality, in other words, could be a global warming due to pollution, because of pollution from factories and unsightly factories themselves. Yeah. This unsightly factors basically cause this cost, or visual cost, in other words. It just distorts the nice view otherwise if these factors were not there. Could have been enjoyed. Yeah? That the nice vision that could have been enjoyed is destroyed by this unsightly factories. Their smoke creates all this environmental damage, and also creates the visual damage to the otherwise beautiful places. Now, external benefits of production include, in the process of production, companies usually conduct research and development, developing new technologies, and once they produce the new technology, these ideas become much more common eventually, and become cheaper as well. The original researching or developing company eventually kind of helps others to create advanced ideas. Remember, the computers, when they were created, they were very expensive because research and development costs were very expensive. So when priced, they would have been quite highly priced, and then it wasn't afforded by every household back then. But because others copied from the original computer and made different variations of computer, models of the computers, eventually it became less costly. So original research and development costs, or research and development efforts, made it possible to sort of come up with the more efficient computers, much more cheaper ways of producing them, right? So this is the benefit of research and development to others. Another external benefit of production is forestry. For example, businesses create forests, or grow forests, so in pursuit of profits. Let's say for building, to supply building industry or construction industry. However, by expanding the forests, by growing them, they're actually benefiting the atmosphere, which then benefits the bystanders. In fact, the bystanders then do not pay for it. That's why this is an externality, or positive externality. Yeah? So let's call this R&D, research and development, and forestry. Right. So next, external cost of consumption. We usually see lit as a sort of a byproduct of consumption, or the consequence of consumption. Yeah, whatever we consume, we tend to see. We all try to put them into litter bins, but nevertheless, some of the litter spills out and creates this external cost of consumption. And you might have also noticed that on trains, on buses, some people have earphones, but then the volume, the music volume they've been listening is too high, and that is also an external cost that causes distraction to others who might want to read books, but they get this unwanted noise. or some people basically talk loudly on so they, by consuming the mobile phone services, they just talk loudly and then they distract others. So yeah, so these are the external costs of consumption. Or smoking, for example, yeah, is another. Loud noise from the use of mobile phones or e-phones, yeah. That's the second one. Next one. External benefits of consumption. Any consumption of any medicine that would keep you healthy and as a result keep others healthy, yeah. So let's call them vaccination or consumption of medicine. So vaccination is a good example. Or pedaling to work, pedaling to uni, for example, it is an external benefit, creates an external benefit to others. Or if you have a nice garden, nice garden would basically create this external benefit to your neighbors. By looking at your garden, they may enjoy it basically, right? Or painting your house, for example. Who wouldn't want to have a nice neighbor with a painted and polished house?